On the morning of December 15th, 1966, a light rain fell over the quiet hills of Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. In a hospital room just a few hundred meters from his film studio, Walt Disney took his final breath. He was 65 years old. The news spread around the world within hours. But somewhere else, everything remained strangely silent. 355 North Carrollwood Drive, the house where Walt Disney lived some of the happiest years of his life. No lights were on. No laughter echoed through the rooms. No sound of the small trains he loved more than any other pastime. In that moment, the house was no longer a home. It became a question. What happens to a place that once held the dreams of a man who made the impossible feel real? What is lost when the creator is gone but the space he lived in remains? And why, years later, would this house disappear completely, as if it had never existed at all? This story is not about movies. It is not about Mickey Mouse, and it is not about Disneyland. It is about something far more private, a quiet estate, a railroad running behind a garden, a moral decision that ended one dream and gave birth to another far greater than a lifetime. If you have ever believed that Walt Disney never slowed down, if you have ever thought he always chose magic over risk, then the story behind the gates of Carrollwood may force you to reconsider. Because there was a moment when what Walt feared most was not failure, but the possibility that his joy might harm a child. And from that moment on, everything began to change. Before the house was torn down, before the tracks were removed, before a backyard dream became a global kingdom. We have to go back, not to Hollywood, but to a quiet place far away, where a young boy once sat beneath a tree, dreaming of trains. If you value stories like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And now let us return to where it all began. In 1906, the United States was entering one of the fastest periods of industrial expansion in its history. Cities like Chicago were growing at an unprecedented pace. Factories multiplied, immigrants poured in, and with that growth came crime, instability, and social tension. In this context, Walt Disney, then only 4 years old, left Chicago with his family. Their destination was Marceline, Missouri, a small agricultural town with a population of fewer than 2,000 people, surrounded by cornfields and railroad tracks. The Disney family purchased a farm of roughly 45 acres, nearly 18 hectares by modern measurement. By early 20th century standards, it was a substantial property, but also an enormous physical burden. Walt's father, Elias Disney, was a strict man who believed deeply in discipline and manual labor. He did not leave Chicago out of nostalgia, but out of fear. Not long before the move, 2 neighborhood boys had been arrested for killing a police officer. Elias did not want his children growing up in a city where violence had begun to seep into everyday life. To him, Marceline represented safety, but to Walt, it became something else entirely. While his older brothers worked the fields from early morning, Walt was still too young for heavy labor. His responsibility was to watch over his baby sister, Ruth, and he always chose the same place. Beneath the wide branches of an old cottonwood tree at the edge of the farm, the family called it the dreaming tree. There, Walt would sit for hours, doing nothing, simply watching. Rabbits, squirrels, field mice, small animals passing quietly through a child's field of vision. And sometimes, at the edge of the meadow, a young deer would appear, motionless and silent. Decades later, Walt would still remember those moments clearly. He once said that on a good day, Bambi would come by. This was not a random childhood memory. It was in Marceline that Walt began to draw. A neighbor, Dr. Sherwood, noticed the boy's ability and paid him to sketch a picture of his horse. The amount was modest, but it marked something significant. It was the first time Walt earned money from an image, a simple exchange. Imagination traded for value. But Marceline gave Walt more than drawing. It gave him something else, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Trains. The Disney farm sat near the tracks of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, one of the largest rail networks in the country at the time. Each day, steam locomotives weighing tens of tons thundered past, shaking the ground beneath them. Walt would stand near the tracks, watching iron wheels turn, listening to whistles tear through the air. He learned that one of his father's relatives worked as an engineer on that line. Not a legend, a real person, a real profession. For a child of 4 or 5, this was an early understanding of movement, of journeys, of a world far larger than the farm in front of him. But Marceline also carried a quiet social contradiction. The farm was not profitable. Weather was unpredictable. Crop prices were unstable. And Elias Disney's health began to decline. By 1911, when Walt was 9 years old, the family was forced to sell the land. Marceline ended not in tragedy, but in economic reality. A place that had nourished imagination, but could not sustain a family. Walt left, but the memory remained. Years later, he wrote that the most important things in his life had happened in Marceline. This was not nostalgia. It was a clue. When Walt Disney later designed Main Street, USA at Disneyland, he was not copying an idealized American town. He was reconstructing Marceline as it had existed in the memory of a child, cleaner, safer, and never again vulnerable to being sold off by necessity. When he built Disneyland, he did not build a street. He rebuilt his childhood. But this was only the foundation. Because after Marceline, Walt Disney's life would move into a far harsher landscape. A place with no dreaming tree, no open fields, and no time left to sit in the shade and draw. And it was there that a flaw began to take shape. In 1911, the Disney family left Marceline. Not because they had stopped loving the land, but because Elias Disney's health no longer allowed him to farm. The 45-acre property was sold. The family relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, an industrial city growing at a rapid pace, with a population already exceeding 250,000 people at the time. For Walt Disney, then 9 years old, this move marked a sudden rupture. There were no fields anymore, no dreaming tree, and no quiet afternoons spent drawing in the shade. Kansas City was a different environment, more crowded, louder. Driven by labor discipline, Elias Disney purchased a newspaper delivery route. This was not a side job. It became the family's primary source of income, and the responsibility fell almost entirely on his sons. Every day before sunrise, Walt woke up at around 4 o'clock in the morning. Not once, not for a season, but for years. At 9 years old, he carried heavy bundles of newspapers, walking miles through residential streets, in rain, in snow, and in the biting cold of Missouri winters. According to later accounts, the Disney delivery route stretched over 7 kilometers each day and had to be completed before the school hours began. If he was late, if he missed a house, if he made a mistake, the consequence was not a reminder. It was strict discipline. Elias Disney believed that early labor built character. He did not see it as cruelty. He saw it as necessity. This became the first major social conflict shaping Walt Disney's life. A child living under adult expectations, inside a city that ran on efficiency and punctuality. There was no room for hesitation, no tolerance for delay, and within that environment, a flaw began to take shape. Walt developed an obsession with time, with precision, with things happening exactly as planned. Years later, he would acknowledge that many of his compulsive habits originated during this period, not as a complaint, but as a fact. But Kansas City did more than impose discipline. It created quiet resistance. After school, after finishing his newspaper route, Walt sought out inexpensive art classes. He drew on anything he could find, discarded newspaper sheets, the backs of flyers, scraps no one wanted. This was not a hobby that received encouragement. It was an escape. While his days were controlled by schedules, the night became the only space where his imagination went unsupervised. But this is where the story turns, because discipline did not only suppress Walt, it forged drive. He learned how to work while exhausted, how to complete tasks without motivation, how to continue even when no one was watching. These skills were not taught in classrooms. They were forged on the sidewalks of Kansas City, while the city was still asleep. However, the cost was real. Years of pre-dawn labor meant chronic sleep deprivation, inconsistent academic performance, declining health, and more importantly, his childhood was compressed, not erased, but pushed deep beneath the surface. That still does not explain the real mystery. Why would a man raised under such rigid discipline devote his entire life to creating controlled joy for millions of others? The answer does not appear here. But Kansas City laid the groundwork. A man capable of relentless work. A mind caught between the need for order and an irrepressible urge to imagine. That tension would continue to build, and it would soon drive Walt Disney toward his first truly risky decision. A decision that would pull him completely out of childhood. In 1917, World War I entered its most brutal phase. Within a single year, the United States mobilized more than 4 million soldiers, sending hundreds of thousands to Europe. Factories shifted to wartime production. Civilian life was pulled into the machinery of war. In this climate, Walt Disney was only 16 years old, too young to enlist, but old enough to feel unable to stand aside. In 1918, Walt made a reckless decision. He lied about his age to join the American Red Cross as an ambulance driver. This was not a safe role. Red Cross drivers did not carry weapons, but they operated just behind the front lines. They drove along cratered roads, transporting wounded soldiers, sometimes bodies that were no longer whole. According to Red Cross records, casualty rates among support units during this period were not significantly lower than those of combat units. Walt was assigned to France at a time when the war had already claimed millions of lives. For the first time, a boy raised between rigid discipline and private imagination came face to face with mass death. But this is where the story turns. Instead of drawing quietly in a notebook, Walt began drawing directly on his ambulance run. No rough sketches, exaggerated faces, imaginary characters appearing amid mud, smoke, and exhaustion. Not for art, but by instinct. Soldiers who saw the vehicle laughed, not loudly, just briefly, enough to soften a long and brutal day. According to later recollections from fellow drivers, Walt's ambulance became easy to recognize from a distance, and it carried a noticeably different atmosphere. In a place where everything revolved around survival, laughter became a form of emotional relief. This marked the first moral conflict Walt encountered. War demanded absolute discipline, but human beings needed a reason not to collapse. Walt did not heal wounds. He did not save lives through medicine. But he noticed something else. An image could shift a person's emotional state within seconds. That still does not explain the real mystery. War was not a stage, and laughter did not end the fighting. Yet in the darkest environment imaginable, Walt began to understand that entertainment was not a luxury. It was a necessity, not to erase reality, but to endure it. By late 1918, after the armistice was signed, Walt did not immediately return to the United States. He remained in Europe for several months, driving, repairing vehicles, and continuing to draw. The sketches from this period were no longer purely innocent. They moved faster, they carried clearer expressions, and they served a purpose. The war did not turn Walt into a soldier, but it sharpened his awareness of an audience. A person who was tired, a person who was afraid, a person who needed to be pulled out of darkness, if only for a moment. This decision changed everything. When Walt Disney left France, he carried no medals, no official honors. He carried a realization. If a drawing could rescue a single bleak day on the battlefield, could it rescue an entire lifetime? The question would not be answered immediately, but it followed Walt back to the United States. And it would soon lead him to another city, another industry, and his first real gamble, an art form called animation. In 1920, Kansas City was no longer a place of childhood. After World War I, the United States entered a short but chaotic period of growth. Small businesses appeared rapidly and collapsed just as quickly. Within that environment, Walt Disney, then only 21 years old, decided to turn what he had learned during the war into a real profession. He founded Laugh-O-Gram Studio in Kansas City, Missouri. This was not a proper film studio. It was a small rented office, a few cramped rooms, in a group of young artists, most of whom were rarely paid on time. Laugh-O-Gram produced short animated films based on classic fairy tales, shown before feature films at local movie theaters. From a creative standpoint, the idea was progressive. Stories like Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood were already in the public domain, required no licensing fees, and were familiar to audiences. Animation was cheaper than live-action film. It required no actors. It was not dependent on weather, and it could be produced continuously, but the business model did not keep pace with the idea. The theaters paid slowly, contracts were loosely structured. Production costs quickly exceeded revenue. Within 2 years, Laugh-O-Gram faced constant cash flow shortages. Walt refused to lay off his staff. He borrowed money, he paid his animators first, and accepted not paying himself at all. At the time, he believed that if the product was good enough, the system would eventually correct itself. But this is where the story turns. By early 1923, Laugh-O-Gram had completely lost the ability to operate. Rent went unpaid. Equipment was pawned and then seized. Employees drifted away, not out of resentment, but because they had no other choice. According to bankruptcy records, Laugh-O-Gram was formally dissolved. When Walt Disney left Kansas City, he carried less than $40. Adjusted for inflation, that amount equals roughly $600 to $700 today, not enough to cover a single month's rent in any major city. This was the first major collapse of his life. Not because of the money lost, but because it shattered his belief that effort alone could guarantee control. He had worked relentlessly. He had applied strict discipline. He believed hard work was sufficient, but systems do not operate on devotion. They operate on cash flow. That still does not explain the real mystery. Because during the final days of Laugh-O-Gram, when the company was already collapsing, Walt created one last project, not to save the studio, but to save himself. That project was called Alice's Wonderland, a short experimental film combining a live-action girl with hand-drawn animation, an idea that was barely commercialized at the time. The project had no real budget, no distribution contract, and no expectation of being shown in Kansas City. It was created as a sample reel, something that could be pitched in a place with a real distribution network. When Laugh-O-Gram went bankrupt, Alice's Wonderland was the only thing Walt managed to keep. And that explains why he did not return to his family, did not seek stable employment, and did not abandon animation. Instead, he boarded a train to California. In August 1923, Walt left Kansas City with an old suitcase and the film reel of Alice's Wonderland. At the time, California was not yet Hollywood as we know it today. Los Angeles was growing rapidly, with a population of over 500,000, and the film industry remained fragmented. Walt arrived in Los Angeles with no contract, no studio, and no professional network. He stayed in his uncle's garage. There, a new figure entered the story. Roy Disney, Walt's older brother, 8 years his senior, had just been discharged from hospital after long treatment for tuberculosis. Roy was not an artist. He had financial experience. And more importantly, he understood risk. This decision changed everything. The two brothers decided to form a company together, not with major investment, but with a clear division of responsibility. Walt handled creativity. Roy controlled finances and legal matters. They named the company Disney Brothers Studio, operating out of a small office on Kingswell Avenue. Minimal equipment, almost no staff, and no assurance that this attempt would succeed. But one thing was different. Walt had failed once, and Roy would not allow the same failure to repeat itself. One brother dreamed excessively. The other was cautious to the point of rigidity. Two opposing forces now moved in the same direction. There was no applause, no newspaper coverage, no sense that an empire was beginning. Just two brothers, a small room, and a lesson from Kansas City still painfully fresh. Yet from that lowest point, something critical was formed. Not magic, but structure. And that structure would soon be tested by another shock, larger and far more ruthless. In 1924, Los Angeles was not yet the center of power in the film industry. Small studios survived on short-term contracts. Power did not belong to creators, but to distributors. Inside a modest office of the Disney Brothers studio, a new figure entered the story, Lillian Bounds. Born in 1899 from Idaho, Lillian moved to California after her father passed away, living with her sister while searching for work. She applied to the Disney studio as an ink and paint artist, a job requiring near absolute patience, coloring frame after frame, hundreds of times each day. Walt Disney personally interviewed her and personally hired her. There is no record suggesting this was a romantic moment from the start. Only one small detail appears repeatedly in later recollections. After late nights at the studio, Walt often drove female employees home, and Lillian was always the last to step out of the car, even though her house was the closest. No confession, no boundary crossed, just a few extra minutes added to an already exhausting day. But this is where the story turns. Because this relationship formed at the exact moment Walt began to lose control. After early successes in California, the Disney Brothers studio signed a contract to produce a new character for Universal Pictures. That character was called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. At first glance, it was a major breakthrough. A small studio gaining access to national distribution, wide release, guaranteed exposure. Oswald debuted in 1927 and succeeded almost immediately. Within a single year, Oswald appeared in hundreds of theaters across the United States. His image spread through posters, advertisements, and early forms of licensed merchandise. At the time, Oswald was considered one of the most recognizable animated characters in America, in an industry that was still very young. But that success concealed a critical truth. The contract was not in Walt Disney's name. Ownership of the character belonged to Universal, and actual production control rested with Charles Mintz, Universal's distributor and representative. Walt did not immediately grasp how serious this was. He believed that commercial success would give him leverage, that once Oswald proved his value, he could renegotiate budgets, production terms, and creative control. In early 1928, Walt boarded a train to New York to negotiate. He carried release numbers, audience reactions, and the belief that he held the upper hand. But this is where everything collapses. In that meeting, Mintz did not raise the budget. He cut it. And then he revealed the final truth. Most of Walt's animators had already secretly signed contracts directly with Universal. If Walt refused the new terms, he would lose Oswald, and lose his entire team. Not eventually, immediately. This was not negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Walt left New York without his main character, without his staff, and without control. This was not a creative failure. It was a legal and power failure. This decision changed everything. On the train ride back to California, inside a narrow railway compartment, Walt began sketching a new character, a mouse. He wanted to name it Mortimer. According to multiple accounts, Lillian shook her head. She said the name sounded gloomy and distant, wrong for what they needed at that moment. She suggested another name, Mickey Mouse. There was no long debate, no presentation, just a sentence that was listened to. Mickey was not merely a new character. He was a direct response to the loss of Oswald. This time, Walt and Roy ensured that ownership belonged to them. The same mistake would not be repeated. Lillian did more than suggest a name. She appeared at the precise moment when Walt needed a grounding force, as ambition collided with the limits of power. The two married in 1925 in Lewiston, Idaho, in a small private ceremony. Walt was 23, Lillian was 26. There was no grand wedding, no spotlight, just two people stepping into a future neither of them could yet imagine. Later, they would have two daughters, born in 1933 and 1936. As Walt built an empire, Lillian kept the rhythm of family life intact. After Walt's death in 1966, Lillian lived on for 31 more years. In 1969, she remarried John Trujans, a real estate developer. The marriage was quiet, unconnected to power, unconnected to branding. Lillian died in 1997 at the age of 98. Throughout her remaining years, she never wrote a memoir, never redefined Walt Disney's legacy. She preserved memory by not turning it into her own story. And that is the final paradox of this chapter. The woman who helped name one of the most famous symbols on Earth chose to remain behind it, not out of weakness, but out of understanding what needed to remain untouched. In 1933, in the middle of the Great Depression, when nearly 25% of the American workforce was unemployed, a child was born into the Disney family. The first daughter of Walt Disney and Lillian was named Diane Disney Miller. It was a moment full of contradiction. Outside the studio, America was contracting, cautious, and losing confidence. Inside the Disney studio, Mickey Mouse was becoming a cultural phenomenon. Short films were commissioned one after another. Merchandising began to expand. Revenue grew, but so did pressure. Walt entered a new role, not just as a creator, but as the operator of an increasingly complex system. But this is where the story turns, because success did not bring balance. Walt worked with almost no boundary between time and labor. He controlled details. He demanded perfection, and he rarely left the studio. Family life existed in scheduled gaps. That was why an informal agreement emerged. Saturday became Daddy's Day. It was the one day Walt stepped away from the drawing board, away from meetings, and belonged only to his family. Not as leisure, but as necessity. In 1936, the Disney family welcomed another child. After several miscarriages, Walt and Lillian decided to adopt a baby girl named Sharon Disney Lund. The decision was not publicly discussed at the time. In American society of the 1930s, adoption was often kept private. The Disney family maintained a quiet and stable image, in sharp contrast to the rapidly expanding company. That still does not explain the real mystery, because the place that shaped Walt's next idea was not the studio. It was Griffith Park. On Saturdays, Walt took Diane and Sharon there. He sat on a wooden bench, ate peanuts, watched his daughters ride the carousel. Around them were the public amusement spaces of the era. Outdated rides, unsafe equipment. Spaces that separated adults from children. Children played, adults waited. Walt did not participate. He observed, and through that observation, a social contradiction became visible. Mass entertainment at the time was not designed for families as a unit. It split the world in two, one side for children, one side for adults. This decision changed everything. Walt began to ask questions. Why parents had no place inside their children's entertainment, why children's joy could not include adult participation, and why public leisure spaces accepted impermanence as a standard. The idea was not executed immediately. It remained an accumulation of observation. Afternoons at Griffith Park, watching Diane and Sharon play, and the quiet pauses when Walt returned to the studio. Here, a familiar flaw reappeared. Walt did not know how to stop. He loved his family. But he was not there long enough. Daddy's Day existed because the rest of the week was consumed by work. This contradiction did not erupt into tragedy. It lingered and accumulated. On one side, growing success. On the other, the desire to create a place where families could exist together, not merely stand beside one another. At the time, no one saw this as a revolutionary idea. It was too personal, too ordinary. Yet from those very small afternoons, a new concept was quietly forming. Not an amusement park, but a family park, a place where adults were not excluded from children's joy, and children were not separated from the world of adults. That still does not explain the real mystery, because to turn that idea into reality, Walt would face a challenge far greater than creating an animated character. He would have to learn how to design living space, not just stories. And that was where everything was about to enter an entirely different chapter. A new land in the return of the trains. By the late 1940s, the war was over. America entered an unprecedented period of expansion. Factories shifted to civilian production. Families moved away from city centers in search of land. Land became the new symbol of stability. For Walt Disney, this was not a time of rest. It was the moment an old obsession returned. Trains. Not as metaphor, not as nostalgia. Real trains, steam engines, rails, switches, schedules. What had once been a childhood fascination now returned with the intensity of adulthood. This was not memory. It was a need for structure. But this is where the story turns. Because this obsession did not form in isolation. One of Walt's closest collaborators at the studio was Ward Kimball, one of Disney's senior animators and an equally devoted railroad enthusiast. Kimball built a working railroad in his own backyard. Real locomotives, real tracks, operational signals. Walt visited often. He did not simply watch. He asked questions. He memorized layouts. This interest was technical. Not long after, Walt attended the Chicago Railroad Fair, a national exhibition celebrating 100 years of American railroads. There, he did not only see trains, he saw people, how crowds queued, how they moved through space, how a pathway guided emotion. Here, trains were not just transportation. They were rhythm, arrival, waiting, departure. Everything followed order. This still does not explain the real mystery. Because instead of building something public, Walt turned inward. In 1949, the Disney family purchased land in Holmby Hills, an exclusive residential area between Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The property measured 5 acres. To visualize that scale, 5 acres equal roughly 3 full-size football fields. This was not an ordinary home. It was an estate. Walt personally involved himself in designing the house, placement, orientation, flow between rooms. But the true conflict emerged behind the house. Lillian wanted a garden, a quiet space, trees, flower beds, a place to host friends. Walt wanted a railroad, not a decorative model, but a functional railway, with bridges, stations, control. This was not a minor disagreement. It was a collision of two worlds. One sought stillness, the other sought motion. One allowed nature to grow, the other demanded rules. And neither side was entirely wrong. This decision changed everything. The compromise did not remove the tension. It relocated it. Walt built the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad running through the backyard, a miniature steam locomotive, a closed-loop track, named stations, fixed schedules. Walt drove the train himself, maintained it himself, controlled it himself. Guests visited, neighbors watched, children reacted with delight. And Walt observed, where people stood, how long they waited, when they smiled. This was no longer a hobby, it was behavioral study. Designing movement, controlling space, guiding emotion without explanation. Inside the house, the tension remained subtle. Lillian accepted the railroad, but once rails are laid, space cannot return to its previous form. Gardens change with seasons. Tracks do not. Rails dictate direction. And here a familiar flaw resurfaced. Walt did not compromise easily. Everything he loved became a system, even joy. But this is where the escalation becomes unavoidable. Because the backyard was no longer enough. 5 acres were too small for what was forming in his mind. The trains were running, the system worked, but the audience was too small. Family, friends, neighbors. This still does not explain the real mystery. Why a man who had mastered film, sound, color, and storytelling now devoted himself to land and circulation. The answer was taking shape. Not in the studio, not in boardrooms, but in the backyard, as Walt sat on the locomotive, watching it loop endlessly, imagining a place where the track would never end. And that place had already grown larger than any home could contain. The right-of-way agreement, when marriage became a smart negotiation. At this stage, the backyard railroad was no longer an idea. The tracks had been measured. The locomotive had been built. The operating schedule already existed. But there was one problem Walt could not ignore. The land did not belong to him alone. The house in Holmby Hills was a shared space. And in that space, every square foot mattered. But this is where the story turns. Instead of arguing, instead of imposing his will, Walt chose a solution that was unmistakably Walt Disney. He asked the studio's attorney to draft a formal legal document. Its title was the Right-of-Way Agreement. Not a joke, not a handwritten note, a real contract. In it, Walter Elias Disney was formally recognized as the sole owner and operator of a private railroad company known as the Walt Disney Railroad, located entirely within the family property. The document was written in proper legal language. But its opening paragraph was different. It stated that all parties involved currently existed in an atmosphere of love, understanding, and trust, and were strongly committed to preserving it. A sentence that was both gentle and binding. This still does not explain the real mystery, because the agreement did not require only one signature. It required the family. Lillian signed. Their daughters, Diane and Sharon, signed as witnesses. A railroad was approved through family consent. No shouting, no confrontation, only paperwork and signatures. But the compromise did not end there. Lillian had conditions of her own. She wanted to preserve a specific flower garden, and Walt's original track plan cut directly through it. The solution was a tunnel, not a straight tunnel, but a 90-foot curved tunnel running beneath the garden. An engineer warned Walt that building a curved tunnel would cost far more than building a straight one. Walt answered immediately, without hesitation, cheaper not to do this at all. It was not a careless remark. It was a declaration of priority. The tracks could bend, but they would not disappear. This decision changed everything. Because what we see here is not a sentimental Hollywood marriage. There are no grand romantic gestures, no poetic vows. Instead, 2 adults negotiating space, control, and personal boundaries. Lillian did not stop Walt from building the railroad. Walt did not erase Lillian's garden. They did not merge into one. They coexisted through structure. And that distinction matters. Walt did not build family life on emotion alone. He built it on systems. Even love was placed within a framework so it could endure. But this is where the escalation becomes clear, because this model would not remain inside the marriage. It would be expanded, scaled, applied to millions of people. A shared space designed so that each individual felt free to choose, while still moving within an invisible order. The curved tunnel beneath the garden was not just an engineering solution, it was a test. If a family conflict could be resolved through design, could a social conflict be resolved the same way? The question was never spoken, but it had already begun to take shape. And it would soon be answered on a scale Walt had never attempted before. No longer 5 acres, but an entire world. Building the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad, Walt Disney Sanctuary. In 1950, construction of the railroad at Carrollwood entered its official phase. This was no longer a concept, no longer a family discussion. This was real construction. Walt Disney did not delegate the project entirely to contractors. He involved himself directly in every stage, from surveying the land to calculating curves, gradients, turning radii. At the center of the entire system was a miniature steam locomotive named Lilybell. The name was not accidental. It was taken from Lillian's name, not as a gesture of charm, but as a statement. This was not a world separate from the family. The Lilybell was built at a 1/8 scale of a full-size steam locomotive. If enlarged to real dimensions, it would have been a machine weighing many tons. Scaled down, it remained fully functional, operating on authentic mechanical principles. The locomotive was capable of pulling up to 12 adult passengers in a single run. This was not symbolic. It was an operational fact, documented in technical records and later accounts. But this is where the story turns, because the locomotive was only the visible part. The full Carrollwood Pacific Railroad measured approximately 2,615 feet in total length, nearly 800 meters. A closed loop, passing through multiple engineered landscapes, with bridges, elevated sections, sharp curves, and a tunnel. This was not a toy railroad. It was a miniature transportation system. In modern terms, a project of comparable complexity would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, built solely to serve one household. This still does not explain the real mystery, because the place where Walt spent the most time was not the locomotive. It was the Red Barn. A red wooden structure built beside the tracks, modeled after the farm buildings of Marceline, Missouri, where Walt had spent his childhood. Sloped roof, wooden doors, a contained working space. Inside the barn was a machine shop, lathes, tools, technical drawings. This was where Walt escaped Hollywood. No films, no contracts, no pressure from an empire worth hundreds of millions. Only metal, steam, and controlled motion. Walt later said that when he had a headache, working in the barn with his trains made it disappear. Not because of the trains themselves, but because of control. Here, every action produced a predictable response. No audience, no shareholders, no critics, only cause and effect. This decision changed everything, because Carrollwood Pacific did not remain private for long. Word spread, newspapers ran stories, magazines published photographs, friends, artists, politicians came to visit. They did not come only to see the train. They came to see Walt Disney when he was not performing Walt Disney. Weekend runs, steam whistles echoing through a quiet neighborhood, children laughing, adults watching in disbelief. Carrollwood became semi-public, but to Walt it remained a sanctuary, a place of refuge. Not a stage, but a place to recharge before returning to a world growing far larger than his control. And here a quiet tension began to form. The more people arrived, the less private Carrollwood became. The louder the laughter, the thinner the margin of safety. Joy was expanding. Control was not increasing at the same rate. This still does not explain the real mystery, because Walt never built anything without considering the next step. Carrollwood Pacific was not an ending. It was a prototype, a model, a laboratory, and very soon, a turning point would arrive. Not large enough for headlines, but powerful enough to shut down this small paradise. And from that moment, The dream of trains would leave the backyard and move into a space Walt had never dared to test before. The 1953 accident, a moral fracture. By 1953, the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad was no longer a private backyard pastime. Weekend runs had become routine events. More visitors arrived, more children gathered. And with that, the level of risk increased. But this is where the story turns. During one operation, a visitor, not Walt himself, was allowed to drive the locomotive. The speed exceeded safe limits. At a curve, the locomotive derailed. There was no explosion, no chaos, but hot steam vented from the system. A 5-year-old girl ran through the steam before any adult could stop her. She suffered minor burns to her legs. According to later records, the injuries caused no lasting damage. There was no lawsuit, no public scandal. But this still does not explain the real mystery, because what mattered was not the severity of the injury. It was Walt Disney's response. He did not justify the incident. He did not blame the driver. He did not speak of probability. He did not argue that accidents happen everywhere. For Walt, there was only one conclusion. The joy he had created had moved beyond his control, and a child had been hurt. This decision changed everything. In the days that followed, Walt made a decision without committees, without votes, without prolonged debate. The Carrollwood Pacific Railroad would close. No more weekend runs. No more visitors. No more children riding through the garden. The Lily Bell locomotive was dismantled and moved to the studio's machine shop. According to documented accounts, the locomotive was placed into storage and never operated again at Carrollwood. The tracks remained. But there was no movement. Silence replaced the whistle. This still does not explain the real mystery, because this decision offered Walt no benefit. Not financially, not reputationally, not creatively. Instead, he shut down the only true refuge he had built for himself. Carrollwood was not just a backyard, it was an escape. A place away from Hollywood, away from thousands of employees, away from public expectation. And he chose to give it up. Here, a clear moral conflict emerges. A man who built an entertainment empire around children's joy. But when that joy posed even a small risk, he chose responsibility over display. There was no public statement, no press release, no image management, only action. But this is where the reframing becomes clear. The 1953 accident was not the end of the railroad dream. It was a fracture. A moment when Walt understood that joy not designed for safety becomes danger. And if he could not guarantee safety in his own backyard, he had no right to offer that dream to thousands of others. Carrollwood Pacific closed not because of technical failure, but because moral standards had surpassed individual control. This still does not explain the real mystery, because for many people, this would have been an ending. For Walt Disney, it was a phase shift. If the backyard was not enough, another place had to be built. A place designed from the beginning so that joy and safety would not conflict, not through improvisation, but through systemic design. And from that moment of silence, as the Lily Bell rested motionless in storage, a much larger project began to take shape, no longer within a family space, but on a scale never attempted before. Reborn as Disneyland when dreams required boundaries. After the 1953 accident, the Carrollwood Pacific fell silent. The tracks remained, but nothing moved. To many observers, this looked like the natural end of an expensive hobby. For Walt Disney, the idea never disappeared. It simply withdrew. But this is where the story turns, because the idea of a family park had existed long before Carrollwood. It began on Saturday afternoons at Griffith Park. Walt sat on a bench eating peanuts, watching his daughters ride the carousel. Children played. Adults waited. Two worlds separated. The question was already there. Now it came with a new condition. Joy had to be absolutely safe. This still does not explain the real mystery, because Walt did not return to Carrollwood. He expanded it. What once existed in a backyard was now enlarged into a complete system, with planning, with circulation, with control. And at the center of everything, once again, was the railroad. This was not accidental. The Disneyland Railroad was the full-scale version of the backyard dream. No longer 1/8 scale, no longer privately operated. This was a real railway, circling the entire park. a closed loop defining what was inside and what remained outside. But this is where the reframing becomes clear. The railroad was not built merely to transport guests. It was a boundary. Once aboard the train, visitors left ordinary life behind. When the loop was completed, they returned to the real world. Fantasy had an entrance. Fantasy had an exit. Nothing spilled over. Nothing blurred. According to later documentation, Walt viewed the Disneyland Railroad as a physical border between everyday reality and the imagined world. This decision changed everything. On July 17, 1955, Disneyland officially opened. The opening day was chaotic. Many attractions were unfinished. The weather was hot. Infrastructure was overwhelmed. But one thing functioned correctly from the start. The railroad. The locomotive, C.K. Holliday, began circling the park. Its design showed clear similarities to the Lily Bell. Not a copy, but a mature evolution. If the Lily Bell had been a private joy, the C.K. Holliday was a public responsibility. A machine no longer serving personal escape, but collective experience. This still does not explain the real mystery. Because Disneyland was not just an amusement park, it was a space designed to prevent accidents before they could occur. One-way pathways, open sightlines, calculated distances. The lessons of Carolwood were embedded into architecture, not through safety slogans, but by forcing the human body to move correctly. Here, Walt did not control people with rules. He controlled them through design. Fantasy was no longer dangerous because it was contained, and that containment was carefully hidden. This still does not explain the real mystery, because what was reborn was not only a railroad dream, it was a philosophy. Joy had to exist within systems. Freedom required boundaries, and creativity could only endure when it accepted responsibility. Disneyland was not built to display wonders. It was built to resolve a prior failure. A small failure, in a backyard, but deep enough to shape an entire world. From this point on, the tracks no longer ended at a garden fence. They became a circle embracing the dreams of millions. Not because they were larger, but because they were designed so no one would be harmed. The peak of achievement in the shadow of health. In the final years of his life, Walt Disney stood at an unprecedented peak of achievement. By that point, he had received 22 Academy Awards, a record widely cited in biographical accounts and among the highest honors in the history of the Academy. But success did not bring stillness. It brought expansion. But this is where the story turns. Rather than consolidating what he had already built, Walt shifted his focus to Florida. This project was not conceived as simply another theme park. It was envisioned as a complete living environment where work, leisure, and community would be reorganized from the ground up. At the center of this vision stood Epcot, short for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Not a themed attraction, not a destination, but a functioning city guided by technology, planning, and design principles. A place Walt believed could address the problems facing American cities. This still does not explain the real mystery. Because as his vision expanded, his body began to fail. Walt had been a heavy smoker for decades, a habit well documented in historical records. As his health declined, he underwent cobalt therapy, a form of radiation treatment commonly used at the time. The treatments left him weakened. He lost weight. Breathing became difficult. Yet the pace of work did not slow. This decision changed everything. On November 30th, Walt was taken back to the hospital. According to recorded accounts, his condition had deteriorated significantly. During these final days, a story is often repeated and must be framed carefully. There are accounts suggesting that Walt, confined to his hospital bed, used the ceiling tiles above him to imagine the planning grid for the Florida project. Individual tiles became streets. Distances became functional zones. There is no definitive documentation to confirm this as literal fact, but the story persists because it captures something essential. Walt continued to design even when his body no longer allowed him to stand. This still does not explain the real mystery. The conflict here was not between life and death. It was between personal vision and biological limitation. Walt had built his career around systems he could control, but the human body does not follow blueprints. There are no tracks, no schedules. At this stage, Walt was no longer escaping through work. He was racing against time. Florida was unfinished. Epcot had not been tested. His largest dream remained on paper. But this is where the escalation becomes undeniable. Walt Disney reached the height of creative authority at the exact moment his physical presence began to disappear. A man determined to build the city of the future, unsure how many days remained to him. There was no dramatization, no final declaration, only the silence of the body set against the intensity of the mind. This still does not explain the real mystery, because what mattered was not whether Walt lived to complete Epcot. What mattered was that he pushed the dream beyond himself. The plans existed, the structure was imagined, and even without Walt, the system he left behind was prepared to continue. The next chapter would no longer belong to Walt Disney. It would belong to legacy, and to how the world chose to interpret what he did not live to finish. Death, the funeral, and the cryonics myth. On the morning of December 15, 1966, at 9:35 a.m., Walt Disney passed away in Los Angeles. The information was confirmed by major news outlets of the time, including the Los Angeles Times, as well as medical records. There was no grand announcement, no live broadcast. Just an ordinary morning in a city accustomed to the passing of major figures. The funeral was held privately. It was not a public spectacle, not open to crowds. According to official records, Walt Disney was cremated and his ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. The process was swift, quiet, and discreet. But this is where the story turns. Almost immediately, another story began to circulate. People did not speak about death. They spoke about delaying death. A myth emerged and outlived any obituary, that Walt Disney had not truly died, that he had been frozen, that his body was being preserved somewhere, waiting for science to advance far enough to bring him back. This still does not explain the real mystery. There is no official documentation confirming that Walt Disney ever participated in any cryonics program. No contracts, no medical files, no physical evidence. On the contrary, his daughter, Diane Disney, repeatedly rejected the claim outright in interviews. She stated clearly that her father was cremated and that the family had no involvement with cryonics. This information is consistently recorded in biographical sources and widely cited references. So the question remains, why does the myth persist? This is where the psychological hook appears. People do not believe Walt Disney was frozen because of science. They believe it because they cannot accept the idea that he ended. Walt Disney was a builder of worlds. He created characters that endured. They did not age. They did not die. For many, the idea that he too had to obey biological limits was emotionally unbearable. Cryonics became a way to delay the ending. Not for Walt, but for the audience. This still does not explain the real mystery. Because the myth reveals more about those who believe it than about the man himself. It reflects a deeply modern ethical conflict. We celebrate people for the worlds they create, yet we refuse to accept that they themselves do not belong to those worlds. Walt Disney spent his life building fantasy with clearly defined boundaries. But after his death, those boundaries dissolved. Fantasy spilled into reality. This decision changed everything. The death of Walt Disney did not close the story. It opened a mythology not created by him, but created by those left behind to comfort themselves. There is no evidence that Walt Disney waited to be revived, but there is overwhelming evidence that the world was not ready to say goodbye. And perhaps that is his final legacy. Not a park, not a character, but the ability to make people believe that something beautiful might not be finished, even when it ended long ago. Lillian after Walt, the one who remained, and how memory was kept. After the death of Walt Disney, Lillian Disney entered a different chapter of life. Quieter, out of the spotlight, but remarkably long. In the years immediately following the funeral, she withdrew from public life. Few statements, no executive role, no attempt to step forward. Lillian's role at this stage was not to succeed. It was to hold the rhythm. But this is where the story turns. In 1969, Lillian remarried John Truyans. He was a former professional football player, later involved in real estate. This marriage carried no mythology. It was private, rarely discussed. Built on companionship rather than symbolism, John Truyans passed away in 1981. Once again, Lillian returned to solitude, but not to absence. This still does not explain the real mystery, because in the years that followed, Lillian reappeared in a different role, not as Walt Disney's widow, but as a cultural patron. In 1987, she pledged $50 million to the project that would become the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. At the time, it was one of the largest private donations ever made to the performing arts in the United States. The project did not materialize quickly. There were years of delay, design revisions, financial complications. The concert hall finally opened in 2003. Lillian was no longer alive to witness that moment, but her name was permanently embedded in the building's legacy. This decision changed everything. Because the way Lillian used wealth was not about extending a brand. She did not build new parks. She did not create new characters. She invested in public space, music, architecture, places where people gather not for instant entertainment, but for lasting experience. For decades, Lillian existed as a quiet witness. She did not revise Walt's story. She did not polish it. She did not dismantle it. She allowed history to remain layered. This still does not explain the real mystery until the final days. On December 15, 1997, Lillian suffered a stroke. She passed away the following day, on December 16, nearly 31 years after the death of Walt Disney. A temporal coincidence strong enough to make one pause, not to mystify, but to recognize duration. Lillian lived more than 3 decades as the one who remained, not to retell the story, but to prevent it from being distorted, not through words, but through choices, by investing in things that do not fade quickly. This still does not explain the real mystery, because there is a quiet paradox here. The man who built imaginary worlds is remembered through characters. The woman who remained after him is remembered through real spaces. Music fills the air. People sit side by side, without needing to know Walt Disney, yet they still inhabit the consequences of a vision carefully preserved. Lillian did not prolong the myth. She slowed it down. And it is that slower rhythm that kept the story from ending too soon. The house that was sold, demolished, and what remains. After Lillian Disney passed away in 1997, the house at 355 North Carrollwood Drive was no longer a residence for any member of the Disney family. Ownership of the property passed to Walt Disney's 2 daughters, Diane Disney Miller and Sharon Disney Lunn. Neither of them lived in Holmby Hills, and the house itself was never built by Walt Disney as a monument. It was built to be lived in, not preserved. In 1998, the property was sold for approximately $8.45 million, consistent with market values at the time. This still does not explain the real mystery, because the question is not about price. It is about the decision. Why did the Disney family let the house go? The answer lies in the nature of legacy. Walt Disney's legacy did not reside in a single address. It already existed in films, theme parks, and popular culture. The Carrollwood house was a private space, closely associated with his final years, with illness, and with withdrawal from public life. Keeping the house did not necessarily preserve joyful memories. And the Disney family never declared that this property should become a museum. This decision changed everything. The buyer was Gabriel Brenner, a real estate investor. After acquiring the property, a full inspection was conducted and revealed serious structural issues: aging plumbing systems, materials containing asbestos, and extensive deterioration after nearly 50 years of use. According to real estate reports at the time, renovation would have been more costly than rebuilding. In 2001, Walt Disney's original home was demolished. On the same land, a new mansion was constructed, approximately 35,000 square feet in size, more than 6 times larger than the original house. But this is where the story turns. Not everything disappeared. Several elements were preserved: the original entrance gate, a portion of Lillian's rose garden, and most importantly, a 90-foot curved tunnel built beneath the garden in 1950. On the stone arch at its entrance, the year 1950 remains carved into the keystone. It is the final physical trace of the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad. In 2014, the property was sold again for approximately $74 million, as reported by Los Angeles Times. The financial value increased dramatically, but the meaning could not be recovered. The house where Walt Disney once lived is gone forever. What remains is not a building, but fragments, a tunnel, a gate, and an absence where memory once existed. Walt Disney's legacy was large enough to survive without preserving the house where it began. And that, perhaps, is the greatest paradox of Carrollwood Drive. The barn and the tracks that were saved. When the house on Carrollwood Drive was sold, not everything disappeared with it. A different decision was made, quieter, but deliberate. The person behind that decision was Diane Disney Miller. Diane understood one thing clearly. The house could vanish, but her father's creative space should not. Among everything that remained, one structure carried particular meaning. The Red Barn. It was not a secondary building. It was where Walt Disney worked with his hands, where he built locomotives, where he retreated from the pressure of an empire in motion. But this is where the story turns. Before the house was demolished, Diane arranged for the Red Barn to be carefully dismantled, each piece numbered, preserved, and transported to a new location. It was reassembled at the Los Angeles Live Steamers Railroad Museum in Griffith Park, Los Angeles. Not as a cold exhibit, but as a space brought back to life. Today, the Red Barn is open to the public on the third Sunday of every month. Inside, Walt's workbench remains. His tools are still arranged as he left them. The space still carries the scent of oil and aged wood. No long explanation is required. Standing inside is enough. But the Red Barn was not the only thing saved. The tracks of the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad were removed beginning in 1964. In 1965, Walt Disney donated approximately 1,500 feet of track to the live steam railroad community. On October 22, 1966, less than 2 months before his death, an event known as the Disney Loop took place. It was not a major ceremony. There was no stage, no speeches. Only tracks connected once more, and a complete loop run to the end. After Walt's passing, the remaining sections of track were donated by Lillian Disney in 1968, quietly, without announcement. Rails that once ran through a private garden became shared heritage. This still does not explain the real meaning, because what was saved here was not wood, not steel. It was the spirit of making things by hand. The Carrollwood Pacific Railroad no longer exists as a line, but it lives on in a community, in a museum, in tracks that still carry trains. After loss, not everything was erased. Some things were transformed. The Red Barn no longer stands behind a private home. It stands in public view. The tracks no longer belong to one family. They belong to memory. This is not nostalgia. It is continuation. A quiet victory after everything that was lost. Lily Bell in the museum today. The Lily Bell locomotive no longer runs. It is displayed at the Walt Disney Family Museum. Not placed in a theme park, not outdoors, but behind glass in a quiet, controlled space. The engine is compact. The metal still carries marks of hand-finished work. The wooden cab holds details assembled by Walt Disney himself. This is not a replica. It is the original locomotive. Built at 1/8 scale, weighing hundreds of pounds, once pulling family, friends, and children along the tracks behind the Carrollwood house. Now it stands still, and that stillness creates a paradox. But this is where the story turns. The Lily Bell stopped running, not because the dream ended, but because the dream moved. Every day at Disneyland, full-size steam trains continue to circle the park. They carry passengers across a boundary between the ordinary world and imagination. These trains are not random creations. They are the grown-up version of a backyard dream. The locomotive rests behind glass, but the idea is still in motion. This still does not explain the real mystery, because what is preserved here is not an object. It is a way of thinking. Walt Disney did not use trains to showcase engineering. He used them to design experience, to guide emotion, to move people from one world into another. The Lily Bell does not need to run anymore to prove its value. It has already completed its role. It was once a sanctuary, a workshop, a beginning. Now it is a reminder that the largest dreams sometimes begin on very small tracks. And even when the locomotive stops, the journey does not. The Carrollwood Pacific was never a backyard hobby. It was a seed of a design philosophy. One where the journey matters as much as the destination. One where the boundary between the ordinary and imagination is drawn by rails. 60 years ago, a boy sat beneath a dreaming tree. 60 years later, an entire kingdom was built from that vision. But here's the paradox. The original house disappeared, replaced by something larger, newer, more expensive. The square footage increased, the market value rose. But meaning cannot be rebuilt with size alone. A playful marriage contract was enough to keep peace at home. A minor accident in 1953 was enough to close a dream forever. Weeks before his death, those rails began a second life. And when the truth became too difficult to accept, people invented a freezing myth to avoid facing an ending. Legacy does not live in what remains. It lives in how something continues to operate in the present, and that leaves us with a question. If you could preserve only one thing from Carolwood, would you keep the house or the tunnel? And why? If you want to keep exploring stories about power, wealth, and their times, and how icons are built and transformed, the videos on screen open more layers of that same world. If this story gave you something to think about, leave a comment, tap like, and subscribe to follow along. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.